Notice the difference here. We're taking the inverse cosine, but it's now it's no longer the inverse cosine of cosine. It's the inverse cosine of sine. It's a different trig ratio. Okay, and so the idea behind this is to understand what the inverse ratios are asking for. Okay, so what's inside this, inside the inverse right here is the sine of pi over 6. Okay, you're asked to find what angle has a cosine that's the exact same as the sine of pi over 6. Okay, and so the way that you will look at that is the following. Okay, if you look at the angle here, or the sine ratio or the sine value that's represented inside, this is asking you to find the inverse cosine of, and what is the actual value of the sine of pi over 6. So here's pi over 6. Has the x-coordinate is the longer one, which is root 3 over 2. The y-coordinate is the shorter one, 1 over 2. Again, being familiar with the unit circle allows you to answer this. So the sine at pi over 6 is 1/2. Okay, and so then the question is asking you what angle within the domain of the inverse cosine has a cosine ratio of 1/2. So here's our cosine, our x values of 1/2 is this angle right here, which is going to be what on the unit circle? So 1/2 and root 3 over 2, so it's going to be pi over 3, right? 2, right? It's pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6. So it's 1/3 pi, or the 60 degrees here. And so your answer would be pi over 3. All right, so you want to find, if you want to evaluate the inverse sine of cosine pi, you need to know what cosine pi is first. So here's cosine pi. Here's pi all the way here. The coordinates of this point on the unit circle are -1, 0. So what is the cosine? The cosine is the x-coordinate, -1. So we're going to take the inverse sine of -1. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to evaluate what that is. So this is asking what angle within the domain of the inverse sine has a sine value of -1/2. Okay, so here's where our angle has to fall, right? The sine is from -pi over 2 to pi over 2, so it's going to be in one of those quadrants. In which quadrant is the sine -1? It's going to be right here, correct? So what is this angle? It's in the negative direction, and it is -pi over 2. So that's going to be your value. Yeah.
Why wouldn't it be 3 pi?
Because the inverse sine is only defined between -pi over 2 and pi over 2. So remember, the inverses have domains restricted to them. So the cosine is only defined from 0 to pi. So your answer has to be in those domains. For evaluating this, the first thing is, what is the sine of pi over 4? Pi over 4 is this 45 degrees. The sine, or the sine and cosine values, root 2 over 2, root 2 over 2. So the sine is root 2 over 2. And so now what you're finding is within the domain of cosine, which is quadrants 1 and 2, from 0 to pi, okay, what angle has a cosine of root pi over 2? And the answer would be right here, right? Root pi over 2. So it is, what angle does this correspond to? Yeah, so it's pi over 4. Okay, and that would be your solution.